next. So I'm going to be talking about kind of playing on the plasticity theme, taking maybe a different scale of inquiry. I'm going to be talking about ecophysiological trade-offs across scales, kind of marrying the intra-individual plasticity up to the macroevolutionary scale. So today, like I just said, I want to talk about the impact of trait plasticity on our ability to understand the evolution of functional traits and strategies, especially using phylogenetic comparative methods, and then also the evolution of trait plasticity among species and what it can maybe tell us about trait-trait interactions. So that's sort of my goal, kind of those two of those themes from that original special issue back in 2003. So in my perspective, we've made a lot of progress over the past 15 years in describing major variation among species in trait space, sort of describing the bounds of trait space globally, and also doing kind of cool things like using functional traits to try to quantitatively describe plant ecological strategies. For instance, in this rather recent study, using Grimes' CSR triangle and trying to use plant traits, to assign species into this sort of set of ecological strategies. However, we've also learned that plastic variation in functional traits can be really large, really large. So this can be due to growing conditions, or it can be due to things like ontogeny or other sources of variation. So some of our own work in, say, sunflower, here's the same species across global, well, it's a little washed out, but there's that global glop-neck cloud, I assure you. Variation amongst experiments, just the same basic germplasm grown in different conditions, same thing here in another species, or here 3 species moving through their ontogeny through this trait space, this cloud of global glop-neck trait variation. Or this paper that I loved that came out a couple years ago in coffee. So this is Coffea arabica. It's only like 4 cultivars, but here's the variation. This is photosynthetic rate and nitrogen, photosynthetic rate and leaf mass per area across sites and management regimes, under canopy, out of canopy, etc. It's like this is one species. Look at that variation versus the global cloud of points. And I hope in the back you can see it better than I can up here, but this is that global cloud of points. And this is like a ton of variation in one species. Or this paper that came out pretty recently, Dayrell et al. Looking at that quantitative CSR, let's assign species to strategies. Here are juveniles versus adults from a particular environment. Look how much movement there is with ontogeny within individual species. So clearly there's another scale going on here that we need to be thinking about. So given that functional traits are often quite plastic, sometimes they're fixed, sometimes they're really plastic, what's the best way to examine correlated trait evolution and trait evolution in response to environment? So how do we put together plasticity and phylogeny and environment to do something, try to get at this or incorporate this? So I'm going to talk to you today about some work I've done in dogwood, so genus Cornus, so also osiers and some other names for these groups. But this is a really diverse genus. It's got about 50 species, depending on who you ask. That's the case in most groups, right? But they vary from herbs to very large trees. Most are woody shrubs. And they have a lot of variation in leaf traits and a lot of variation in reproductive traits as well. So I'm going to try to be focusing on both the macroevolutionary scale and also the within individual scale. And the source of that within individual variation that I'm focused on today is seasonality. So this is work I started as a postdoc at the Arnold Arboretum. And so the sampling was done in that location. So we sampled 25 taxa, so 25 species or subspecies, and again, it depends who you ask, up to 4 individuals of wild origin per taxa. And we sampled leaves over 6 months, from May to October, from very start of the growing season to just before the first frost. And we measured things like leaf economics traits, associative traits related to productivity, and also physical and chemical defenses, 26 traits in all, including a lot of macro and micronutrients. And we used the Cornus phylogeny of Zhang et al. 2006, which in that case ITS phylogeny and quite well resolved, to do phylogenetic comparative work. We also aggregated herbarium records from GBIF and IDBio to get a sense of environmental variation among species. So we pulled out those occurrence records that validated from herbarium records and environmental data from a variety of publicly available sources for data layers of variation in climate and soils and growing season information. So first, if we look at the within individual scale of variation, all but 2 of our 26 traits show really large directional shifts within a growing season. So if each one of these curves is May, June, July, August, September, October. So, and this is plotted by growing degree days. So water content falls, chlorophyll falls, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium all fall. LMA increases, lantern density is something kind of interesting. Calcium increases, flavonoids fall. Some of these chemical defenses like flavonoids and tannins kind of go down and up. There's a lot of variation here. And in most of these traits, it doesn't seem like it's just noise variation based on sampling. It's really large changes. So another thing to point out is these traits do not shift independently of one another. So for instance, here we've got LMA and tannin activity, and we've got nitrogen content, water content, and total chlorophyll. And each of these lines is just 5 species, so just throwing 5 species up here, each of these lines is 1 species through time in sort of May to October sort of trajectory. So these seem to shift together through trait space, and in general they tend to shift from more resource acquisitive combinations of traits to more resource conservative. It's kind of a wiggly set of terms, but in any case, typically from something like, say, low LMA, high nitrogen down to the sort of down in this other corner, or water content in LMA, or chemical defense with chlorophyll and things like that. So a lot of variation, and it's not independent. So if we switch to the other sort of scale of inquiry, macroevolutionary scale, so question arises, how do we analyze this data? So we could take kind of a traditional approach where we would do, like most studies wouldn't have this data, right? That you go out and you sample, say, species in a common garden environment or field site at a particular point in time. You have that data, and that's your species data, right? So let's try that. So if we do that, and we do it at a particular time point, let's say May, we would do something like this, a phylogenetic least squares regression, giving ancestral construction. We could look at how these traits evolve with one another. And if we do that, we find, for instance, just for an example, chlorophyll content and tannin activity have a really strong negative relationship, R squared of 0.65 across species. You know, hey, that's a cool pattern, right? Problem, if we do that at every time point, we get really, really different answers. So we get trait relationships that completely go away, that were super strong in 4 weeks, sampled 4 weeks earlier. So for instance, nitrogen and phosphorus here, that's 0.66 positive relationship, gone next month. We have things, very few things are consistently significant across months. Some things wink in and out of significance. So, how are we supposed to deal with this, right? So this is a problem, right? I find this troubling, given that we have a body of literature and we have to put it together. What do we do with this? If we go with trait-environment relationships, it's even worse. So it's even less consistent. We have some relationships between a trait and environmental variable that increase over the growing season in strength, some decrease, some wink in and out. We have some that switch sign and go from being like nitrogen, here's nitrogen and growing season length, it's negative 0.52 R squared to positive 0.39 R squared, beginning into the growing season. I don't know what to do with that, except maybe we can infer something from this, I'm not sure. But this bothers me quite a bit. So several challenges that I think about this. One, what does it mean when trait relationships change over time? Like, is there a way we can interpret that? What do we get from that information? Can we interpret something, like for instance, if nitrogen and growing season length flip from the beginning and the end of the growing season, is there something we can infer biologically from that, or not? Can we? I'm not sure, statistically, whether we can. That's kind of a lot of things to wrap your head around. Also, many studies use trait data sampled at a single time point, like a field site or a common garden. And so does that mean that the conclusions of our studies are really dependent on when we did our sampling? That bothers me a lot too. And if this has such a large effect at the scale of one genus like this, where lots of other things are being controlled, what effect does that have on these really heavily used trait databases that lots of folks use for big scale questions? That also bothers me quite a bit. So what if we try something different? So what if we explicitly combine all of this into one analysis? So we're trying something here, putting together that plasticity with environmental data on phylogeny. So this is using function value phylogenetic comparative methods. These are kind of young, so there's lots of ways one could do this. We're going to try something. So let's do a really simple approach, easy to understand. We're going to fit polynomial functions to those curves, those seasonal shifts. We're going to use metrics derived from those curves and use those as our traits. So for instance here, we could take these curves, we could take the baseline trait value, that's sort of like y-intercept, sort of our May value. We could make a metric of the absolute amount of plasticity, this sort of seasonal breadth. We could also do like an area under the curve thing to get directionality as well as magnitude. So that might be like area under the curve, positive, negative, or a mixture thereof, and reconstruct these. And if we do this, what do we find? Well, if we do this, we can think about looking at the shifts in two traits together. So we can talk about the degree of shift for any trait and track how the magnitude shift evolves on the phylogeny. And if we have two traits, we can look at whether they evolve together or not. So in this case, you have really correlated evolution, it seems. You get more shift in one trait, you get a lot of shift in the other trait evolving. When less shift evolves in a species, in that lineage, you get the evolution of less shift in the other trait. It's kind of saying the word shift a lot, but I think you get what I'm going at here, hopefully. If we do this, let's just look at a couple of traits. I can't do all 26, but let's take LMA and water content, for instance, two traits that are often used. These are really tightly negatively correlated, both within individuals, and their degree of shift also evolves together. So they move in your lockstep within individuals over time, and as you get the evolution of more shift in LMA over the growing season, you get the evolution of more shift in water content inversely over the growing season. So you can kind of actually just see this. This is just a zoomed in slice of part of the phylogeny. These are like mirror images, right? They evolve together. The shifts evolve together as well. This is an R squared of 0.5 with EGLS. Other traits, though, that might have been very significantly correlated in our by-month analyses, they are not correlated when we're looking at this scale. So the evolution of seasonal shifts in one trait is not correlated with the evolution of seasonal shifts in the other trait, like LMA and nitrogen or LMA and tannins, etc. So to me, as I think about this seems relevant to thinking about the scales at which trait relationships, trait interactions, or trait trade-offs sort of arise. So I tend to think of this as sort of two ends of a spectrum. At one end, you have these sort of tissue or organ level trait interactions. There are certain combinations of things that are simply not possible. So these sort of biochemical or biophysical limits on leaf form and function. For instance, you have to have a certain amount of chlorophyll in order to have a certain photosynthetic rate. Or maybe you need a certain vein density or architecture to support a certain hydraulic conductance. So that's happening at the level of the leaf. And you get a single plant could manufacture different leaves with different physiologies, but those are going to have to move together. The other end of the spectrum is selection of whole plant function, sort of strategies. There's maybe optimization, so correlations that arise because of the fitness costs of having inefficient combinations, rather than having a direct interaction at the organ level. So you could have a combination that's decoupled, you could make something, it just may not function in a way that supports fitness. So maybe things like leaf shape and water use efficiency, or nutrient content investment and chemical defense investment. Those are things that, at least from first principles, maybe they don't have as much of a strong connection at the leaf level. So whether these are emerging at one scale or the other, you should observe those among species. But if they're emerging at this scale, we would think that they would also be evident even within individuals. So in terms of their plasticity. So something to think about. So traits that show strongly correlated within individual plasticity, I think probably that is evidence that it arises at the level of the leaf or tissue itself. Whereas traits that do not, probably that arises more at the level of selection on whole plant function. So one last thing, which is what about environment with this? So given that we have these strong seasonal shifts in cornice, do these evolve within a habitat environment? Yes, there's a lot, but just some highlights of this. We find larger seasonal declines in leaf nitrogen on high silt soils relative to sandier soils. So that might be related to more acquisitive strategy on more fertile soils. We find larger seasonal declines in leaf micronutrients on more alkaline soils. So that might be maybe more resorption of these micronutrients where uptake's more difficult in these alkaline soils, less bioavailable. We find larger early season increases in leaf area, so prolonged expansion, in habitats with less consistent rainfall. So that's maybe like a more careful expansion, steady instead of just expanding loosely and being vulnerable to low water availability. We find less seasonal variation in leaf phenolics in habitats with longer growing seasons. So maybe that's more of a constituent defense strategy versus induced defense strategy. In any case, hey, maybe we can infer some stuff from this. So that's a lot, but what do I want you to take away from this? One, plant functional traits are often highly plastic, and we need to take that into account when studying their evolution. Two, function valued approaches exist. They're a thing you can do, and they can allow us to ask different kinds of questions than traditional approaches. Three, trait-trait relationships might originate at different scales, something to be explicit and maybe think about. And four, trait plasticity evolves both in relation to other traits and the environment. And that degree of plasticity might be as or more important than trait values. So something to think about. And with that, I just want to say, if you think this is interesting, please check out these papers. And if you're a phylogenetic comparative methods person or one who thinks about maybe improving those, we need more methods. This is a very young area, so help. And with that, I'll take questions.